Bonjour and bienvenue.
Hello and welcome.
I think I got it. Nous sommes en France et donc
We are
on
in
m'a demandé
France,
de parler
and so
français.
therefore I've been asked to
Mais
speak
je
French.
suis un peu, comme on
But,
dit, lazy. Et donc je vais changer.
I'm actually not that good at speaking French, so I will
le reste du panel
speak
sera en français,
English,
donc vous avez la traduction
but the rest of the
simultaine.
panel will be in French, so you will have access to simultaneous interpretation. And I hope that will work.
I'm Paola Subacchi. I'm the chair of Sovereign Debt and Finance at Sciences Po here in Paris. I'm going to moderate this panel today on the debt challenges. And I have an exceptionally good panel with me today, and I'm going to introduce them. Then I will ask a few questions, but basically, I would also like you to be engaged in this discussion. So we will carry on chatting and talking, but please ask questions to the panel. Just raise your hand and ask the questions. So to make this short session a bit more interactive. So as you know, there are many challenges around sovereign debt, around debt. And as you say, debt vulnerabilities remain elevated, in particular in low-income countries. And so we have countries that are already on that distress, but countries that are really struggling to keep their debt sustainable. And in particular, the big challenge is how to face high cost for servicing this debt. And so the focus of this session is very much on debt sustainability and how to create more fiscal space, allow countries then really struggling with that servicing cost to get more fiscal space. So we're going to investigate some cases to get an overview of these challenges, investigate some cases, and also explore some instruments that can be helpful. So now I'm going to introduce my panelists, and you can see them on the screen up there. I will start with Mr. Lancinet Diaby, exactly at my immediate left. Mr. Diaby is the Director General of the Finance Department at the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. Welcome, or bienvenue. And then next is Friederike Röder, Director of the Secretariat of the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force. Welcome. And then third, William Rose, very well-known person in Paris and in the debt space. And William now is a Managing Director for Corporate Strategy, a member of the Executive Committee at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, otherwise known as the EBRD. And last but not least, Stéphane Charbit, Managing Partners and Government Advisory at Rothschild. So welcome all. I will start with you, Friederike, and I ask you to give us an overview of the challenges that low-income countries, developing countries are facing as we speak to really with long-term challenges, thinking particularly investment in climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and all the investment that are needed for long-term development and sustainable long-term development, and the fact that they need to service their debt, because otherwise they will get into a difficult and debt distress. Can you give us an overview of what is at stake at the moment?
Thank you, Paola. And very good to be here and to see a lot of people joining us today. So I think you already set the scene. There is, or there has been, and it will continue, a lot of discussions around the debt crisis that is amplifying, which is for some countries a solvency issue, but which is also a liquidity issue for others. But if we zoom out a little bit, we do have the problem of the existing debt stock. We need to avoid countries running into further debt distress because, for instance, of extreme weather events, and Jamaica is the best example, unfortunately, now. But more generally, we need to ensure that countries, and in particular those that are most vulnerable to climate change, that already have many challenges like high rates of extreme poverty, for instance, actually have access to adequate financing. And I think it is about access to financing at the right time, but also the adequate financing, so the quality of financing. And we're in Paris here, and nearly 2.5 years ago, President Macron convened a summit, the new Global Financing Pact, the Financing Summit here in Paris. And I just realized that I'm speaking English.
Yeah, I realized it too.
Je vais changer en français, pardon.
So I'll actually switch to French. So the idea for this summit was that there's a problem in terms of financing and debt, and that no country should have to choose between fighting climate change or fighting extreme poverty. And I'd like to go back on two major advances that were made during the summit and that are still extremely relevant, especially because the situation hasn't gotten better, unfortunately. The first one is that talking about access to financing, I've already spoken about Jamaica, and unfortunately that is a very relevant example, but there are many other countries that are in such a situation, and in such situations where natural disasters are involved, such as hurricanes, for instance, these countries need to have quick access to liquidity. And one major progress that's been made is, and William will speak about this, I'm sure, but it's a very interesting tool that I think can be used more generally, is suspensive debt clauses. If there's a natural disaster, a country can suspend payments, and that it's the calendar of repayments that will change, and for creditors that is acceptable, and that allows the country to have more liquidity and to react more quickly, which is very important to avoid additional costs. And you've also spoken, Paola, about investing in long-term resilience, and that's also a very important subject, especially for countries that have very high debt, that use a part of their budget in order to reimburse that debt. They need to keep access to financing, and I want to mention here solidarity levies. And it's a really simple idea, extremely simple. The idea is just to tax sectors that are highly globalized, and many of them are also extremely polluting and under-taxed. And that can be done in countries of the global north, such as France, but also countries of the global south. And there's a very concrete example that I can give, which started out 2.5 years ago at that summit I mentioned, but in Belém we'll talk about it. The idea is to tax most polluting flights, so people who are flying in first class, business class, or in private jets and business jets, and to invest that money in climate resilience, not just in the global south countries, but in global north countries that are facing climate change as well, even though the challenge might be not quite the same in those countries. So these are extremely concrete tools to bring financing in crisis and on the long term to help these countries to fight these challenges, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't find solutions to debt, but I think we should include these tools in the larger discussion. Thank you.
I think it was very interesting because you really highlight the key trade-off, as we say, between, again, paying, servicing debt to avoid then countries get into that distress. But at the same time, there are two issues. One is the long-term investment, in particular in climate adaptation mitigation, but also the fight against poverty, extreme poverty, and that is a very important point. And again, is now rather than in 10 years or in 20 years or even in a shorter term. It is now. And then countries really, to some extent, sacrifice their long development for paying their debt. And also it's very important, the suggestion you made, there are many suggestions on how to practically address these issues and these challenges. You mentioned some, and the question is open. We can see it with Jamaica, with the clauses for that contract to suspend their payments in case of natural disaster. But we see also in other examples, and now I'm turning to Mr. Diaby, because in your country you did a very interesting, arranged a very interesting instrument now with the World Bank, which is the swapping debt for development. So, Mr. Diaby, can you tell us a bit more and maybe put this innovation, this innovative instrument into the context of Côte d'Ivoire?
Merci beaucoup. Alors nous sommes
Thank you very much.
constamment à la recherche d'outils.
We're constantly looking for tools to create a fiscal space, and you mentioned earlier that that was the idea. So firstly, the first tool we can use is simply to just levy more taxes. And that is what we have done in Côte d'Ivoire, and for a few other countries, we had to support a few external shocks, such as COVID and the Ukrainian crisis. But after COVID, we had a deficit of more than 6%, so we realized we needed to mobilize strategies to get to levy more taxes, and we did that rather aggressively. And we were able to have less budgetary pressure in that way, and we went back down to 2 or 3% deficit. So that created more fiscal space for us. However, proactive management of debt is a supplementary tool to get more breathing room in our budget, and so we explored that. For that solution to be effective, we also need to be able to contract a relatively cheap debt and with a longer maturity. And so we explored different solutions. We had management solutions such as Eurobond from 2024, which allowed us to look for liability management solutions. And we're in discussions with the World Bank Group in order to use their AAA guarantees. As I said, the most important thing is cheap debt and long-term maturity. And I'm sorry to use this English word, but we have got to leverage the guarantees of the AAA guarantees of the World Bank in order to get this financing. So the World Bank in 2024 gave us a partial credit guarantee of 240 million euros. And we were able to use that to get financing, 400 million euro financing, and that was 60% of the amount that was needed. And we were able to leverage financing over 15 years with a 5-year grace period, which we used to reimburse relatively short-term loans in our portfolio. So you could see that had a large impact in terms of fiscal space. And the cost of this new debt was around 200 basis points below our Eurobond curve. And so that 5-year grace period and 15-year debt and the 200 points below the Eurobond curve allowed us to save what we estimate to be 230 million euros over the next 5 years. And so that is a really typical way to manage liabilities in a very effective way. And the idea was to simplify these transactions, but the same kinds of transactions that were done in very complex ways before, such as SPV offshore transactions, and there were extremely complex rules. So this was an onshore transaction, if I may say. The borrower was the Ministry of Finance in Côte d'Ivoire, and resources were given out to an existing project, a World Bank project to construct schools. So there was much less complexity in that sense. There was an existing program that was financed, with the net value of the money that was saved from debt servicing compared to the prior strategy that was used, and we estimate that we saved 260 million euros, as I said, and so that allowed us to scale up a World Bank project that was already in place. So concretely, we built 30 more schools and high schools for many students, so that was a win-win situation. It allowed us to get more fiscal space, and we were able to have liability management services in a moderate way, and we had a very concrete result on the ground.
Virtuous circle. And let me go back to your first point. Obviously, fiscal space is created through a fair and wide taxation. So again, this is the mobilization of domestic resources that was very much the topic in Seville, the Finance for Development Summit in Seville last July. But there are two very important points in your virtuous circle. One is the extension of the duration, the maturity of this debt, and also the reduction in the cost of servicing this debt. And the very important point is that the savings is not, let's say, used for anything you can, basically for budget support, effectively, but is used for very important development projects. That's why it's called debt swap for development. So the idea is it's not freeing fiscal space just to as a budget support, but is fiscal space freed for development purposes. And as you say, it's a project in education. And you said also two important points about the involvement of external actors. And one are the multilateral development banks, i.e. the World Bank, but also other advisors. So that allows me to bring in Stéphane first and then William. So Stéphane, just again to you. This is an example of a virtuous circle created to free fiscal space for development. Again, you got a lot of experience in advising governments for that solution, for managing that challenges. Can you tell us a bit more about innovative instruments that can be implemented, again, for helping with the fiscal space and development?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Firstly, Paola, I want to say we need to remember what the nature is of this crisis that we're talking about. To go back to the title of the panel, the difference between the current crisis and the past crises is that the current one is is not very visible, and it's a silent crisis. And Côte d'Ivoire is an extremely virtuous example of what could be done, but the reality is that for many years, a certain number of countries are using a larger and larger amount of their resources to simply repay their debt burden. 10%, 20, 30, 40%. Egypt is an example. Egypt uses 33% of its resources to service its debt.
Et c'est une différence importante parce qu'on n'est
That's
pas
a
dans
massive
une
difference
crise
because
visible.
it's not a
On n'est pas dans
visible
une crise
crisis.
de solvabilité,
It's
comme en
not
parlait
a
Frédéric.
solvability
On est
crisis.
effectivement dans une crise silencieuse où des
And
pays
so
ont de
we're in
moins
a
en
silent
moins de marge de
crisis.
manœuvre
There's
pour
less and
assurer
less
des
breathing
dépenses de
room for
fonctionnement, mais
countries
surtout
to
pour
for their countries to function, but for their
Et donc,
countries
ça
to
rend les
invest as
mécanismes
well.
d'autant plus difficile à mettre en place parce qu'on est
So
dans
these
quelque chose
mechanisms
qu'il
are
faut
harder and harder to
anticiper. Et il faut
implement
qu'on
because
anticipe les secteurs sur lesquels
there
il y a
are
besoin de plus
future
d'investissement.
actions
Et il
that
faut
we need
anticiper
to
les bonnes
anticipate,
mécaniques
which sectors
d'accompagnement
need
des États
financing,
pour
and
leur donner de l'espace
mechanisms
fiscal et leur
of
permettre de faire ces investissements.
in order to give budgetary
Deuxièmement,
space
ce que
for these
je voudrais
countries,
dire,
or fiscal space for
on
these
ne fasse
countries.
pas que se
And
féliciter du cas de la Côte d'Ivoire.
I also wanted to say,
C'est
and
que
so
ce
that
qu'on
we
fait
don't,
aujourd'hui
we're not
collectivement,
just
c'est
patting each other on the back for the Côte d'Ivoire example. I want to say that what we are doing collectively only has a tiny impact. You were talking about the 2023 summit. We estimated at the time that the financing need in emerging countries in order for the ODD goals to be reached, the SDG goals to be reached, we estimated we need around $3 trillion to $4 trillion per year.
Le monde
And
qu'on appelle le monde du blended
when you've got
finance, c'est-à-dire
debt
la
swapping
combinaison
in the
du
blended
secteur officiel
finance
et du
world,
secteur privé
that is to say,
pour
the
dégager des marges de manœuvre
institutional
fiscales
sector
à
and the private
travers
sector
des
trying to
bonifications,
work together to get more
selon
debt
l'OCDE,
space
50
for
milliards
these
par an,
countries.
selon
And the
l'Institut de
OECD says
référence
it's
dans le
around
domaine qui s'appelle
$50
Convergence, 25 à
billion
30
a
milliards
year. Another
l'ordre de
institute
grandeur,
estimates that it's
c'est
around
qu'aujourd'hui, on
25
fait
to $30 billion a
1%
year. So
de ce qui est nécessaire.
we're doing about 1% of what we
La
need to be
dette
doing.
n'est pas le centre de tout.
So
dans
debt
la
is
gestion d'un
not
État.
everything
dette n'est pas
when
le
you're
seul levier.
managing
Il y a aussi un
a
levier
state, and debt is not the
fiscal,
only
il y
lever.
a
There's
un
also a
levier,
tax lever
de
that can be
réforme
used.
structurelle, mais sur la
There's
partie
structural
de la
reforms that
gestion
can
de
be
la
put in
dette, on
place,
fait aujourd'hui
but
1%
for
de ce qu'il
debt
faudrait.
management, we're only doing 1% of
qu'est-ce
what
qu'on
we
doit
need
mettre
to
en
be
place et
doing.
comment on peut
So
faire plus?
what do we need to do? What do we need to
Il y a
implement?
3 grands acteurs dans cette
There's
conversation.
3 main actors that we need to talk about.
Le premier acteur,
The
qui est à
first
ma
one
droite,
being
c'est
to my
les
right,
banques multilatérales
multilateral
et
banks
bilatérales de développement.
and bilateral
Le deuxième
banks
acteur,
and bilateral
c'est le secteur
development
privé.
banks.
C'est les
Then
investisseurs.
there's
On
the
pense
private
toujours
sector,
ou souvent que c'est les banques
investors. We
Mais en fait,
always
c'est pas
think
vraiment les
it's
banques
banks, but it's
qui
not really
investissent et qui
banks
prêtent de l'argent.
that invest and
C'est des
lend
fonds de
money.
crédit,
It's
c'est des fonds d'asset
credit
management,
funds,
c'est des fonds
asset
de pension,
management funds,
c'est ce qu'on appelle aussi le shadow
retirement
finance,
funds.
c'est-à-dire des institutions pas forcément
So
réglementées
these are
qui ont
not
la
necessarily
possibilité d'investir
regulated institutions, and they're able to invest in Côte d'Ivoire, in Colombia, in Uzbekistan, in the energy transition sector, or they can also invest in oil and gas in Texas. So we need to be able to think about that. And the third kind of actor is the regulatory sector. So for instance, the World Bank that is able to establish standards and the rating agencies and all regulating agencies. So we need for these 3 types of actors to speak to each other, and not just speak to each other, but to understand each other, because as it stands, they do not understand each other, and their decisions are contradictory. I'll give you a few examples. We've all heard these past few years calls from multilateral development banks to have more guarantees. And indeed, it is more efficient, and the Côte d'Ivoire case really shows us that it is more efficient. But as for seeing how these guarantees are implemented and how they're counted, we've gone backwards. When banks are giving out guarantees, it costs them just as much as it would if they were giving out a loan. And another contradiction has to do with ratings agencies. We often talk about risk premiums and when investing in poor countries. But there is a difference between the reality and the perception of what real risks are. There's a new database called the GEM, the Global Emerging Markets Database, which has shown that over the past 35 years, the risk of defaulting in projects in emerging countries in which the institutional sector intervenes, the risk is between 0.5 to 1%. So that's a really low risk of defaulting, and the consequence should be that ratings agencies give better ratings to these projects.
C'est-à-dire apporter
the swaps that we be able to put in place is give technical assistance, expertise from multilateral development banks in order for there to be guarantees to allow countries to get good debt with better ratings and cheaper financing.
Thank you, Stéphane. Very important point. I think I'd like to stress what you said at the beginning, that this is a sort of non-visible crisis. It's a crisis that touches many countries, but because to some extent there isn't a systemic impact, then it goes sort of under the radar, but it affects many countries and the livelihood and the lives of many people. So it's very important not to lose track of this. And also it's very important to really contextualize this discussion within this Paris Peace Forum. Again, Friederike mentioned the summit 2 years ago on people and planet. And again, it's the same thing. The prosperity of people is part of this, the world we want to be, and a peaceful and prosperous world. So very, very important. And very important also, you mentioned the players in this game. And so we got one here. And again, William, I'd like to go back to what Mr. Diaby was saying about the role of the World Bank in structuring, arranging this debt swap for development. So the guarantees that the World Bank, so a multilateral development bank, put on the table to address the issues that Stéphane mentioned, which is the perception of risk. So the fact then if the World Bank guarantees, everybody feels a bit more comfortable than giving credit to developing countries, if I can put it this way. So William, can you tell us a bit more how the development banks, multilateral development banks, I stress multilateral here because obviously EBRD multilateral, but as Stéphane said, there are also bilateral development banks then play a role here.
Merci beaucoup Paola. Ça marche, vous m'entendez? Oui.
Thank you very much, Paola.
Effectivement, merci beaucoup
de
m'avoir invité à ce panel.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. And I'm happy to be here and give you the point of view of multilateral development banks and how we work with countries. I'd like to say something important, which is supporting countries on debt management. Technical assistance to offices that are in charge of debt and assisting governance between these offices and other ministries. South Africa organized a few months ago a dialogue on this topic, inviting a few dozen countries from Africa and G20 countries as well. And we saw that this topic of internal governance, to not spend money if the liquidity is not there, that was also extremely important. And all these topics of transparency to do with national internal transparency, that was important. Now I'd like to go back to financing and funding. There's multilateral banks that are working on budgetary support. And in Côte d'Ivoire, that was the case. There was a program supported by the IMF with budgetary secondary financing with very low cost, with long maturity. And so many countries have benefited from that. There need to be synergies between these actions of multilateral development banks and also bilateral development banks and creditors that are able to help these countries that are in fragile situations so that they can have net positive flows. These past 2 years, it's really helped to have a larger point of view of these liquidities, and the IMF and the World Bank worked on an approach in 3 pillars to liquidity. And that mentions a bunch of examples, such as the Côte d'Ivoire one, but a multilateral bank, as was explained, hands out its rating and allows a country to give out cheap loans. So that does work, but only if there's a risk problem, a risk perception problem, but it doesn't work if the country is about to go bankrupt. And it worked with Côte d'Ivoire with this passive, this liability management system. You were able to work without multilateral, without bonds issued by multilateral institutions. And so that is important to think about as well.
For multilateral banks like the EBRD, which have a private sector mandate, we act in an indirect way, and we can bridge the funding gap at the level of the balance of payments. In specific cases such as Ukraine, we can bring liquidity to support public funding. So we help in this situation. But generally speaking, the EBRD approach, as well as other development banks' approaches, is to have a global view of the banking market and work with the country in a political dialogue to strengthen this local banking sector. We strengthen the independence of the country's bank. We work on all financial securities, derivatives, and the repo markets to align them with international standards. It's very important because this is how we can bring in a private funding without any support from the World Bank. Something that is quite striking in the EBRD's action in many countries is to be active, just like local banks, on the short-term market, on the monetary market. It issues securities, it invests, and creates liquidity in local currency. So it helps structuring the local financing market, and it also gives liquidities to fund local projects. Another thing that we implemented is support to the integration of regional markets, because very often countries are too small to attract international funding. We did this in the Baltic countries. We're also working on 8 stock markets in Central and Eastern Europe, but it also works on small countries. We're able to do this in Georgia, where over time, we're able to strengthen the local financial market structure. What we can also do is that when new bonds are issued, such as cover bonds or other new instruments, we can support by buying, by subscribing these bonds. And that's also an important action of multilateral development banks that can attract funding. And finally, we also work on attracting private funding. As Stéphane was saying, we can have risk-sharing tools, but if we want to scale this up, we have to do it without using too much of concession funding. So we have to work on risk perception. We have to communicate on the risk observed on our portfolios when we invest on private sectors. When a multilateral bank invests on the private sector, it's we do not have priority ranking. So we really have to talk about this, communicate on these actions. We can also do securitization of part of our portfolio. It's also a way we can act. And we need to have risk-based regulation, of course, but that should not penalize securitization securities and systems that we put into place.
But if I can resume it summarize in one word, it's an overall approach. There is not one size fits all. Every case is different, and there is a cooperation, a coordination of different actors, the international level, but also the domestic level, in particular mobilizing domestic capital, where it is possible, because again, not every country have the, let's say, the surplus, the savings to be mobilized, but to create also the structures at the regional level, which is also very, very important. Do you want to say something? While I'm actually turning to the audience, we have 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes. If there are any questions, you just put your hands up, and then I give the floor. Sorry, just while you prepare your question, Mr. Diaby has a point.
Non, je voulais juste rajouter un complément à ce que
Yes, I just wanted to add something to what Stéphane said on the importance of guarantees. I believe that with added standardization of these guaranteed products and more cooperation in multilateral development banks, we could have much more efficiency. Let me give you an example. Côte d'Ivoire had the first sustainability-linked loan implemented by Côte d'Ivoire this year. We were able to get 100% coverage, contrary to the loan for development swaps, which were limited to 60%. And this is because the EBRD, among others, gave us a first loss and second loss guarantee. This had a significant impact because as part of the debt for development swap, we're able to mobilize a facility over 15 years with a grace period of 5 years. And with this structure, we were able to get a 10-year grace period, still over a 15-year facility. So you can see the kind of impact that it can have. And the cost was reduced by 200 basis points. So for the sustainability, we were 400 basis points below the European rate. So if we can cooperate with the development banks to issue this type of instrument, the impact in terms of reducing the cost and extending the maturity are huge. And so multilateral development banks should be able to cooperate to work on this type of project.
A point for you, but after this question is how the multilateral development bank can expand the balance sheet, leverage the balance sheet to be more effective and have more resources to think. But let's go to this question from the floor. If you tell us who you are, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry, I had an issue with my headset. My name is Ivana Emapavkova. I'm from TMP. We're a think tank that works on how climate change interacts with other complex issues, including that. And so my question was about this. We know that climate change is accelerating, that the current newest models that were released by IPCC don't reflect the speed with which climate change is progressing. And so I was wondering if you could speak about how this impact that climate change might have on government receipts, how it might also necessitate increased spending from government to respond to natural disasters. How is this incorporated into the budgetary projections and into the projections of your fiscal space? Specifically for Monsieur Charbit, but of course, if anybody else wants to answer, I would be really happy to hear that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Charbit, do you want to take this question on climate change, how you factor in climate change in your budget?
Yes. So Côte d'Ivoire is a party to a number of international treaties, such as les Accords de Paris, etc. So it's fully reflected in our planning. We have something that we call the National Development Plan. It's a 5-year plan, and that's really across all sectors of the economy. The expenditures are very well detailed in terms of projects, and a number of those projects includes a climate change related project. At the financing level, in Côte d'Ivoire, we've adopted a framework, the ESG framework, which we put in place in 2021, the first version. And that's a framework that is basically used to mobilize resources that are targeted to projects with specific impact, obviously on the social front, but also on the climate front. So we've been able to raise, I think, in total over the past few years, around 5 billion euros of resources that were dedicated to a different type of projects under the ESG framework. So it's clearly within our policy to continue to develop that. And in fact, the transaction which I just mentioned, the sustainability-linked loan, is also a project which was the resources will be fully dedicated to projects that should ultimately help us achieve our objectives, because we have two types of KPIs under that transaction. The first KPI is to achieve a certain level of energy mix by 2030. I think we should achieve around 60% of renewable within our energy mix. The second aspect, or second KPI in that transaction, is the reforestation that has to increase to a certain level, and the deforestation that has to be contained at a certain level. So it's fully embedded in a different framework. We've received technical assistance for the World Bank Group to come up with those framework, and a big portion of the funds that we raise are under those frameworks and the resource served for those projects. Thank you.
Yes, we have two questions, one here, one there, and you have to be very quick because we have literally 3 minutes, and then they take, please.
Ok, bon, je vais la faire en français.
So I'm going to ask this question in French. Thank you very much for this. I come from Argentina, and I would like to know how much institutions such as the IMF help the countries, and how much they end up destroying them. Just as the example we have with Egypt, we have a higher and higher percentage of our budget dedicated to this.
So we bundle the two together, then we turn to our panel.
So my question will be directly to Stéphane Charbit. It's about the risk premia that Global South countries suffer from rating agencies. I was wondering if you knew about any projects/initiatives to connect Global South rating agencies that are not affiliated to one of the big threes, and if it shows promise in any way.
Thank you. We have literally 2 minutes, and we start with Stéphane, and then come this way for the final answering this question, final considerations.
Merci beaucoup, et je serai rapide.
Thank you very much, and I will be brief. Are there initiatives? Yes, there are, but there is no outcome, really. South Africa, which is chairing the G20 in 2025, implemented the Cost of Capital Commission, which was supposed to take charge of this issue, and not much has happened. I don't believe that the solution would be for new rating agencies to replace the existing agencies. It's rather to convince S&P and Moody's and the other one to changed their approach, and they need to assess the political risk, and that's about half of the assessment of the risk. So let's work on the criteria rather than get new players in.
Sur la question sur l'Argentine, alors là je réponds pas
this question on Argentina, I will not reply as the management of EBRD, but on my personal opinion. What I saw in the last 4 to 5 years is the IMF cooperating with the countries. I was also thinking of Côte d'Ivoire. The reform programs, I believe I see what you mean, the idea that these reforms are imposed by the IMF. But it's a discussion, sometimes a negotiation, but I do not believe what I've seen, at least, is that the IMF and teams have been devoted to working with the countries. Now, the question that you're asking is how do we move on from reform programs over 3 to 4 years to more structural changes? And this is where we need coordinated actions.
Oui, alors juste pour clôturer, ce que je trouve intéressant,
just to close, what I think is interesting is that we see there are many tools, even though we tend to think that the space is quite blocked on debt restructuring. But very often those tools are underused, or sometimes we are going in the wrong direction on the availability of data, the lack of use of the guarantees. I think what would be interesting to look at in Belém and maybe next year with the French G7 is to have a new impetus to actually use all the tools and help things that can move forward, progress, despite the multilateral difficulties we're facing.
Oui, moi je vais peut-être réagir un peu sur l'Argentine et conclure.
Maybe I can just react on Argentina and conclude. I do not view the IMF as going against strategic development goals, or long-term goals of countries. If I take the example of Côte d'Ivoire, we've implemented several programs with the IMF in the past few years, which allowed us to implement ambitious projects. The IMF has assisted us technically, but not only with our tax reform, tax system reform. So there's, at the same time, Côte d'Ivoire has been able to keep working on its strategic orientations through the strategic development plans that I was talking about. And this allowed structural changes of our economy. We no longer rely as much on the primary sector. We have less vulnerability, more added value. I don't believe those are antagonistic objectives.
We are just a bit over time, but thank you for your attention. It was a very interesting and very rich discussion, and please give a round of applause to our panel.